Okay, let me share my slideshow. Hopefully you can you see this slideshow? Lovely. I'm going to be talking to you today about unicorns. But first, I'd like to introduce myself. So my name is Sian Esther Powell. I am a Cornish and Celtic storyteller. So I am the host of the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast, which I've been doing for a number of years now. I've been featured on, I was going to say national, but it won't be national to you. I've been featured on British television, on radio, for talking about various myths and legends and things like that. I'm from Cornwall, which is one of the 6 Celtic nations. It's the county right at the bottom of the UK. As I said, one of the 6 Celtic nations, alongside Wales, Brittany and France, Isle of Man, Ireland, and of course Scotland, which will become relevant later on. So essentially, I'm a mad lady who likes magical creatures. So I'm very delighted to be here with you. Well, not this evening for me, this afternoon for you. So let's jump straight into it. What is a unicorn? What is the unicorn? So I'd like for you for a moment to imagine a woodland, if you will. Imagine a deep, deep forest. Hopefully, you're still seeing the slideshow and you're not seeing me swap between some of my notes as well. So if you can imagine a vast and sprawling forest and you are walking through the forest, perhaps this woodland, comparable to our knowledge of the deep ocean today, has never fully been explored. So there's some trepidation there. This is an adventure after all. The further you venture into the forest, the quieter your surroundings become. The trees are dense, the air is filled with something akin to expectation. Something is about to, suddenly you hear it, a rustling of leaves and the snapping of small twigs underfoot. You stop for a moment and it is silent once again. After a pause, you continue onwards and suddenly you find yourself in an open meadow at the very heart of the forest. But you are not alone. Before you stands a single horse. Now, this horse is unlike any you have ever seen before. Its coat is so purely white that it almost looks like the beast is shining. This creature is creating its own light source and illuminating that forest grove. But this radiance is not the strangest part of the creature. Atop its head rests a single spiraling horn. Now, I am sure that most of us, even if I hadn't introduced the unicorn today, I think that most of us, if not all, would recognize that this classic white horse with a single horn on its head is, of course, the unicorn. Now, the unicorn is perhaps one of the most iconic fantasy creatures found in pop culture that we know of today. We also have creatures like the dragon, the griffin, the phoenix, the fairy, all these creatures that a lot of us would sort of instantly recognize, whether we know their history or not. And the unicorn, I believe, is very much recognized amongst them. So in today's talk, I'm going to be looking at the origins of the unicorn, perhaps where it's come from, what some potential explanations might be. And we're sort of going to go all the way from early antiquity through the Middle Ages and right up to today and what the unicorn means today. So, how old is the unicorn, really? The unicorn is potentially thousands and thousands of years old. So we can first begin by looking at the Indus Valley civilization, which is one of the 3 early civilizations of South Asia and the Near East. And what's particularly fascinating about the depictions of the unicorn here is that they're on seals, which would have been kind of acting as a contract in that civilization. So they're on stamp seals, but also on toys. And they are about 4,000 years old. So hopefully you can see the image there, which is of the seal, and it's got a kind of bovine-like creature with a single horn. Now, I'll kind of talk about the evolution of how we viewed the unicorn, but in various sources, it has been described as bovine, goat-like, horse-like. So it hasn't always been a white horse. Now, you could have argued with these depictions that it's simply an animal with 2 horns, but because it stood on the side, you're seeing it in profile. But actually, there have also been toys found from this period and from this same civilization that depict a unicorn-like creature, that depict a creature with 1 horn. So this is sort of some of the earliest depictions of a unicorn, but really the vast majority of the early evidence we have for the unicorn is from ancient Greek sources. So the unicorn in Antiquity. The unicorn is actually not found in Greek mythology. It's instead found in the writings of natural historians. So that's one thing that's particularly fascinating about the unicorn, is that today we know it as a magical creature, but the unicorn has, for the vast majority of time and belief in it, existed as both a legendary magical creature with magical properties, but also, for all intents and purposes, a real creature. Most people throughout history have believed that the unicorn is a real creature. So when I'm kind of talking through these various sources, they are describing what they believe is a real creature and not a magical fantasy or mythological creature. So the unicorn is first cited, I think, by the Greek natural historian Ctesias. He was writing, he was Greek, but he was writing primarily from Persia. And he, and like many Greek authors in antiquity, believed India to be this kind of magical place that was just close enough, but just far enough away that really everything that they wrote about was, you know, what they were theorizing, what they were coming up with. So Ctesias discusses a 1-horned creature, and from his sources, lots of other Greek authors then followed suit. So you see that he's one of the earliest sources, and because he was living in Persia, he was maybe perhaps giving an air of authenticity, whereas other Greek authors writing from Greece kind of just essentially believed what he was describing and kind of carried that on. And again, this was the belief that unicorns were real creatures. Now, my absolute favorite story from all of the ancient sources pertaining to the unicorn is the story from Cosmos. I'm going to pronounce this horribly wrong, so I'm only going to do it once. Indicaplistus. That's as good as we are going to get, I'm afraid. So in his version of the unicorn myth, the unicorn is a pretty ferocious animal, but that's not anything new. That is a characteristic in lots of stories. But what is great about his version of the story is that it is almost impossible to catch a unicorn, because they will simply fling themselves off any precipice, any large height, and if they fall on their horn, they'll be completely saved. So I really like the mental image of this just poor unicorn, like a cat falling on its feet, always falling on its feet. The unicorn was said to always fall on its horn. So it could be galloping along the cliffs and then suddenly it jumps down, falls on its horn, absolutely fine. The horn, with its magical properties, absorbs the shock of the fall, and the unicorn can carry on as if everything is normal. I wonder how that would work if it was falling into a swamp or a marsh, or whether the magical properties of the horn just make sure that every surface it falls on is solid and it can just brush itself off and walk away. Now, the reason I like that version, one, the mental image is quite funny and quite fun, but two, what you'll see in a lot of the sources and stories that I share today is that the unicorn is often a creature that's entrapped. It's often a creature that people are seeking to lure and to capture for various reasons. So I like a story where the unicorn triumphs and escapes, gets out of trouble. So one archetype that pops up with the unicorn, concerning the unicorn, is the maiden and the unicorn. So this is a belief that stretched right through the Middle Ages, right through the medieval period. But it was actually inspired by a text from late antiquity, the Physiologus. So the Physiologus was written by an unnamed author, but it was written in Greek, possibly from the 2nd century AD, but could well have been the 3rd or 4th century AD as well. So essentially it's pretty old, it's quite an old text, and it became very, very popular in the Middle Ages. So a lot of reproductions in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, right on through. But essentially it is a sort of proto-bestiary, that is a book of beasts. And these books were very, very popular in the medieval period. They were very popular in the Middle Ages, where travel writers and historians, antiquarians, they would write these books, these collections of various wildlife and plant life that described far-flung places on the globe with all sorts of wild and wonderful creatures. Some of them very much real animals, whether or not the artistic depictions were correct. They mostly weren't, but I think some of them for medieval depictions were pretty good. But of course, these bestiaries also included a lot of legendary creatures, so such as the unicorn, but as I've said, people believed these were real animals. So the interesting thing about the Physiologus is that it's pretty old Christian text, so it's really working with allegories. So it's divided by section, and it has various plant life and animal life. And there's a whole section on the unicorn. And this is perhaps one of the first sources where the unicorn is aligned with the idea of, I suppose, purity and virtue and innocence. And that is an idea that has carried on through for centuries following it. And this is where the established sort of classic tale of the unicorn is a solitary creature, and it's very, very difficult to capture, but it can only be captured or lured by a virgin, by a young maiden. And this is a story then that was followed through throughout the Middle Ages, this idea of a young woman, a young virgin, a maiden, luring the unicorn. So the unicorn kind of falls asleep instantly. He sees the young maiden, he walks up to her, puts his head in her lap and falls asleep instantly. Lots of people have had lots of different interpretations of this text, many saying that the virgin represents the Virgin Mary, but there is a lot of different ways that you can interpret it. But yes, the Physiologus was a Christian text, and all of these stories were teaching some kind of moral lesson and using interesting symbolism. So even though this is one of the first sources that has that type of story, and it's in written form, these stories must have existed in an oral fashion as well. There must have been an already established idea of the unicorn as a symbol of purity and virtue already. And this inspired many medieval writings, both religious and also secular as well. So this image here, I'm really hoping that as I change slides, you are seeing them and I'm not just stuck on the same slide. Let me know if I am. But if you're seeing what I'm seeing, then this is a beautiful tapestry of a wild woman with a unicorn, and it's from the Basel Historical Museum in Switzerland. Now, this is so beautiful and it's so intricate, and it shows perfectly that concept of the innocent maiden. In this case, she is a sort of wild woman, just existing in nature with the unicorn. And the unicorn here almost looks like a deer or an antelope. And like I said, it hasn't always purely been described as horse-like. It's taken many forms. Now, this leads me on to the unicorn in medieval Europe. Now, as I've explained with the Antiquity sources, really this is an idea that's just followed on, but the unicorn came to symbolize many different things to many different people. The unicorn was seen as a symbol of strength. It was seen as a symbol of pride, of purity, honor, rarity. Rarity is one of the main things, actually. The unicorn is very much considered a solitary creature. So in the sources, it's never describing a herd of unicorns. It's never describing a family of unicorns. The unicorn is usually a solitary, rare creature. And very often it's sort of the only one of its kind. And again, all throughout the Middle Ages, unicorns were very much believed to be real. They take many different forms. There's lots of different art that exists depicting unicorns in iconography. You can find unicorns in tapestries, like the one I've showed you before. Unicorns have been written about, they've been portrayed in many different artistic mediums, and it's the horn. The Middle Ages is really, really interesting for focusing on the horn of the unicorn, which is otherwise known as alicorn. So when I say alicorn, I'm talking about a unicorn's horn. It's just a little bit easier to say. So the alicorn was seen as extremely valuable, and because unicorns were believed to be real with all of their associated magical properties, such as unicorns were believed to be able to purify water, unicorns were able to cure poison, they were able to heal injury, sickness, mental affliction. So the alicorn, the unicorn's horn, was an incredibly valuable and rare commodity in the Middle Ages, because it was seen as this real property, this real thing that had healing properties. So this, I thought I would include this painting, which is absolutely incredible. It's a portrait of the Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible with a unicorn horn. Now look at this, it's absolutely gorgeous, and of course it's huge. I don't think I can imagine a horse-like creature or a goat-like creature or even a cow, bovine-like creature with that big of a horn. And it's because, of course, this is a narwhal tusk. This is a narwhal's canine tooth. So yeah, not a unicorn horn, but narwhal tusks were hugely valuable in the Middle Ages. So you had Viking traders were trading these tusks for huge amounts of money, because nobles, rich European nobles and royals were buying them up as a status symbol. You can see here he's kind of stood very proudly with his bejeweled narwhal tusk, but it was thought of as a unicorn horn. So you have this really kind of interesting dichotomy of some people so believing that this is, very real. And then, of course, traders and merchants actually, almost exploiting that belief to make lots of money. So whether or not they also believed in it, I don't know. But it's very interesting. I'm assuming that Viking traders, especially being on the sea, knew where they were getting these horns. But narwhals, I think, I'm not a biologist, so I could be completely wrong, but I think they have been around for millions of years. So if you think about the archaeological evidence of bones and horns from real animals such as rhinoceroses, and there have been some extinct species of rhinoceros as well. So there are many animals with a single horn. And of course, the narwhal has the beautiful spiraled horn. So there has to be a lot in existence. So they were big trade. There was a big market for buying these narwhal tusks, very much believing them to be unicorn horns, carrying all the magical properties that they did. So the unicorn, as I've mentioned, as a status symbol itself, has also been used in art and heraldry. So the unicorn, or a unicorn-like creature, has been used by countries around the world on their, lots of European countries have used the unicorn on a coat of arms. This one here that I've got is from Merkin in Lithuania, but it's also existed in lots of different wealthy kind of noble families across Europe have adopted the unicorn as their symbol. Now, there's lots of different reasons for this. As I've said, the unicorn symbolized purity, it symbolized rarity, but it also symbolized strength. The unicorn was seen as a very resourceful, ferocious creature. It wasn't the kind of glittery, sparkly, lovely sort of children's character that we think of today. The unicorn was a fierce creature. So I believe that a lot of noble families were using the unicorn as a status symbol to kind of bolster up their own images and align themselves with these ideas of purity, of strength, of honor, of pride, of virtue, and all sorts of other things, which really does lead me on to one of my absolute favorite facts. And that is that the national animal of Scotland is, in fact, the unicorn. And Scotland has had a very, very long relationship with the unicorn. This relationship, I think, from what I can glean, started with William, King of Scots, in the 12th century, who adopted a unicorn onto his coat of arms. And of course, as the King of Scotland, this wasn't just simply his family coat of arms, this was the coat of arms for Scotland. So that's a very early example of unicorns being associated with Scotland. And then a few centuries later, 300 years later, King James III adopts the unicorn again in the using currency. And I particularly like the idea of the unicorn on currency, because I could be wrong, but I'm assuming that many everyday people were not reading classical Greek Antiquity texts. Most normal everyday people were probably not literate at this time, so they wouldn't have been reading all of these classical texts like wealthy noble families would have been, which I should have mentioned before. In the Middle Ages, of course, wealthy families were receiving a lot of their education in Greek and looking at antiquity and ancient Greek sources, but everyday people wouldn't have been. However, on currency, most people are going to be looking at coins. People are going to be seeing currency. So King James III, by introducing unicorns on coins, on coinage and on currency, was really kind of widening that connection of the unicorn to Scotland for many more people to see. But where it really kind of solidifies is James VI, who adopts the unicorn on his royal coat of arms. So I've put it here. This is the current, this is the UK coat of arms, really. But King James originally had 2 unicorns. So his royal coat of arms had 2 unicorns propping up a great shield. And then, of course, with the unification of the English and Scottish kingdoms in the 1600s, so you've got unification of the crowns, I think in 1603, that's when things start to kind of take a turn, really. This is when Scotland is very much associated with the unicorn, and where the unicorn definitely becomes Scotland's national animal. Union of the Crowns in 1707. Okay, that's it. Bear with me. I had to check my notes then because I had a panicked moment. I thought, oh, that's wrong. Don't quote me on that. But it was 1603 when one of the unicorns was removed and replaced with a lion. So this was when, unification of the crowns was beginning to happen, and I think it's a very important piece of symbolism actually to remove one of the unicorns and put in an English lion. So one thing to note is that throughout a lot of sources and myths and legends, the lion and the unicorn are mortal enemies. So very interesting bits of political symbolism there. But it was in 1707 where you had the Union of the Crowns, which includes Ireland, and this is where you have the lion and the unicorn together holding up the shield. Interesting to note that in the Scottish version, the unicorn is on the left hand side. The unicorn comes first, of course, so it's the first creature you see, and in the English version, it's the other way around. The lion comes first and then the unicorn. The lion usually wears the crown, and the unicorn is usually depicted with chains around its neck. Now, this is a very interesting bit of symbolism for me, because I would say that means not only is, hopefully you're not skipping through all my slideshow with me, but not only is that showing that the unicorn is a wild and untamable creature, so you're showing that with a chain around its neck, it's a wild and untamable, but you are strong enough to tame it. So not only are these wealthy families in Scotland, as well as the royal family, there were other wealthy families in Scotland who used the unicorn as a symbol for their own houses. Not only are they aligning themselves with the unicorn itself and likening themselves to a unicorn, with its strength, its cunning, its resourcefulness, its purity, but they are also making the point that we are strong enough to tame the unicorn. So it has a bit of double meaning there. And an interesting thing to note as well is that the other families that had a unicorn on their coat of arms were sort of in favor of the king. So it was a real status symbol, because they had, not only are they saying, we're strong enough to defeat the unicorn. We're strong enough to tame this wild and untamable beast. Not only are they saying we're like the unicorn, we're pure, we're strong, we're honorable, but they are also letting other families know that they had the king's favor. So a lot of interesting symbolism there when it comes to Scotland and the unicorn. And of course, that is still very, very much in play today. There's lots of market villages and market towns in Scotland, which were originally either by a king or a bishop or someone else in authority granted the permission to hold market there, which is why they're called market towns and market villages. There's a lot of crosses there, and a lot of sculptures in these places with a unicorn, depicting a unicorn. So you can walk around so many areas of Scotland today and see tons and tons of unicorns. You can see unicorn sculptures, you can see unicorns on, various buildings. So they are still very prominent. And interestingly enough, I theorize that some of the ancient sources for unicorns, so that is going back to the texts in Antiquity, they were influenced themselves by sculpture and by architecture. So one of the classical writers was very much influenced by I think 4 brass unicorn sculptures that he saw in the palace of the king of Ethiopia. So not only are these concentrated to one area of the world, the unicorn exists in so many different myths and legends across the world, or a unicorn-like creature. So the interesting thing with Scotland is that, it's not a Scottish mythological creature. This is a creature that has existed for a long time, harkening back to Antiquity. So some of the other similar creatures that you can find that are unicorn-like creatures are the Riem. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but that is found in the Hebrew Bible. You have the Shadavar, which is found in Muslim bestiaries, and this creature was very much associated with bestiaries that you could find reproduced throughout the medieval world, but it was definitely associated with Byzantium. And it has a most beautiful story, actually, the Shadavar, and it's probably one of the nicest unicorn types of stories, is that it has a horn with lots of different holes on, so it can be played like a flute. So as it's sort of sauntering and walking through the woodland and creating beautiful sounds with its horn just swishing through the wind, lots of other creatures stop and listen to it. Such, how beautiful the sound of the music that the Shadavar creates. And it's said that because it's got the holes in its horns, that you can play it like a flute, and one side produces the most beautiful, cheerful, happy music that makes you want to be merry and dance and smile, and the other side of the horn produces very sad, melancholy music. So yeah, music that makes you feel very, very sad. The Karkadan is a creature associated with India and Persia. And that's interesting to me because India, as I mentioned previously, is the area that a lot of the original Greek sources were associating with the unicorn. So very much kind of harkening back to that. And it was the Karkadan, which, although associated with Persia, and with being a sort of unicorn-like creature that can be lured by an innocent virgin and is ferocious and proud. So very, very similar to the kind of the unicorn that we are familiar with. The Karkadan is also the Persian name for rhinoceros. So it's, you know, in bestiaries, it's describing what very much could just be a rhinoceros, but ascribing it with the magical properties that we have come to associate with the unicorn. Its horn having medicinal properties, having the magical abilities to purify water, cure poison, cure illness, but also it is very much just the name for rhinoceros. So there is a case to be made that some of the original beliefs in the unicorn could simply be from rhinoceroses, and especially as there have been extinct. There are, you know, ancient species of rhinoceros that are extinct now that were much larger. So there's a lot of different explanations for the unicorn. And then we've got the Qilin, which is a Chinese mythology. And then we've got the Al Mirage, which is Arabic, and it's a one-horned rabbit. So really nothing like a lot of other unicorns, which are, as I've said, horse-like, goat-like, even like a cow. This is a one-horned rabbit, but again, features in Arabic literature and has its own stories and properties. And then there's also the monoceros. So this is pretty much just a unicorn as we know it, but it's a name specifically used in a lot of the Greek sources. So I think Pliny the Elder and lots of other sources described the monoceros, which was described as having a stag-like head, maybe the body of a horse and the feet of a goat, and then of course that classic spiral horn atop the center of its head. So very much what we know and what we think of as the unicorn today. There have been other creatures as well, maybe more fantastic in nature. So although I've said that Alicorn describes a unicorn's horn, I've also read that Alicorn has described a winged unicorn, so almost like Pegasus versus a unicorn to create a beautiful white flying horse with the horn on its head. So there's lots of different versions of the unicorn. So really that brings me to the unicorn in pop culture, what we today associate the unicorn with. So I've put some of my absolute favorite examples here. You've got the unicorn in Legend. So Legend is a 1985 fantasy film with Tom Cruise and Tim Curry. And a very focal point of the film is on unicorns. And I talk about it at a little bit of length because it's really a perfect example of the medieval unicorn as well. It shows just how long these stories have existed. So stories constantly change and evolve, but in some ways they stay the same, and it's quite interesting to see that. So the unicorn in Legend is a creature of pure innocence and purity. And, you know, it's a very rare and beautiful creature. And much like the maiden and the unicorn concept that we find throughout the Middle Ages, it is the innocent Princess Lily that is able, unwittingly, I don't think she doesn't do it on purpose, bless her, but she is the only one that is able to lure and tempt the unicorn to approach. And the whole film centers around Tim Curry's very scary Lord of Darkness, who is trying to capture the unicorns so he can create an eternal night. So very much playing with those previous concepts and beliefs of the unicorn, symbolizing purity and light and virtue and innocence. So almost allegorical in itself for this 80s fantasy film. Lots of symbolism there, but it plays a sort of integral part. And then you have The Last Unicorn, which is a very highly regarded animated film from 1982, which follows a lone unicorn who is trying to look for the last of her kind. So she is essentially the last of her kind, and she's on a great big adventure to find all of the other unicorns. And she has very much the classic archetypal unicorn look. And although I've shown lots of different depictions of the unicorn, I think the image that has lasted the longest of the unicorn is of a white horse with a single spiraled horn. So it's really interesting that both legend and The Last Unicorn play with that sort of classic version of the unicorn. And maybe I think of it as the classic version because I've been influenced by pop culture. That could be the case as well. And I had to include one of my favorite films, and I've actually, don't know if you can see behind me there, I have my Blade Runner image. So you've got the origami unicorn here, which in Blade Runner, in 1982's Blade Runner is associated with a character who is a replicant, more human than human. So the unicorn could symbolize rarity, it could symbolize being one of a kind, and also that all creatures must die, even the unicorn. So I use these examples because I am endlessly fascinated with how folklore and storytelling and mythology completely and always consistently change and evolve and adapt. But it's really interesting to see these examples very much keeping up with that medieval Middle Ages idea of the unicorn being lured by maidens and being these sort of symbols of purity and innocence. Of course, you can also see it in Harry Potter, and My Little Pony is the big one as well. So here we go, Princess Celestia from My Little Pony, which brings me to the unicorn today. The unicorn today, I think a lot of people would associate the unicorn with this type of image today. That is, a very wholesome, glittery children's cartoon character with a rainbow mane, very, very friendly, very wholesome, very sweet. And in fact, there was a unicorn trend in 2016 on social media, started by a food blogger called Adeline Wow or Woo. And her fans had described her sprinkling sparkles on food as unicorn toast. So I find that really interesting because I doubt many of the fans of this food blogger were folklorists like me, whose whole job is to be crazy and know lots of stuff about magical creatures. And yet they had that instant connection to unicorns. They instantly thought of unicorns and glitter and sparkles and that sort of thing. So this whole trend was centered around pastel color palettes, highly saturated colors, lots of glitter, lots of sparkle, lots of rainbows, and that was adopted by lots of big companies. Starbucks had a unicorn frappuccino. So I include this just to say that these stories capture us even today. And even some of us who haven't read the original texts, the original sources where these creatures first, rear their heads, we still have a very clear and strong association with these creatures and, what they mean. So you can see unicorns in children's toys and cartoons. I think that a lot of this is very influenced by 80s fantasy. Of course, the My Little Pony of the 2010s is a revamp of the 80s TV series. So I think the 80s just had a real love for fantasy, and I think a lot of that is plays with the nostalgia of people today who are creating these other current trends. So there's lots of explanations for what the unicorn is. We of course have got the narwhal tusks. So as I mentioned before, tusks that were, from a real creature that's been around for a very long time, traded with medieval Middle Ages wealthy families and royal families. who very, very, very much believed that it was a real thing. Lots of families would have an item that would be a big status symbol. So they would have a staff made of unicorn horns, or their throne would be made of unicorn horns, or they would have a cup made of unicorn horns. In fact, James VI, that guy again, very important, he tested this theory by making sure that one of his servants took in poison at the same time as a ground up unicorn horn. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and that man did die, probably because he was also, you know, ingesting horrible ground up horn, bless him. So you've got the narwhal tusks, which go a long way into explaining where these ideas have come from, but also archaeological evidence, the elasmorpherium, that is an extinct rhinoceros creature. And then, of course, there are also real animals today and back then, the rhinoceros, the okapi. There's creatures with a single horn that could have inspired the original sources. So I am a big believer in there's always a grain of truth to all stories. Sometimes that grain of truth is a single tiny little grain on a big sandy beach. Sometimes that grain of truth is a great big granite boulder, you know, but there's always some kind of truth to these stories. So as a recap, the unicorn as a symbol has been used as an allegorical Christian symbol. It's been used as a secular symbol of purity, strength, rarity, and honor. It's a symbol of pride and patriotism, of independence against oppressive authority. It's a status symbol. It's a beautiful, magical fantasy creature, beloved of children, you know, and it's a symbol of sparkly food. So it's meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So my theory is that today's unicorn was influenced by 80s fantasy, and that 80s fantasy was influenced by kind of folklore and mythology. Folklore and mythology was influenced by medieval beliefs. Medieval beliefs were influenced by classical Greek writings, and the classical antiquity sources were influenced by architecture and sculpture of ancient merchants traveling around and seeing sculptures of unicorn creatures in palaces, or, you know, finding the stamp seals, finding old toys, you know, lots of architecture and sculpture depicting one-horned animals. And as I said, the architecture influenced by ancient archaeology. So perhaps the bones found of ancient one-horned creatures. I could be wrong. That's just my theory. But at the end of the day, does it actually matter? Does it matter if the unicorn is real or isn't real, or where it comes from? For me, folklore acts as a sort of mirror. I find that when you hold it up, it reflects back the beliefs, the fears, the desires of a people. I think that it's a really underrated historical tool, and it's a really great way of understanding the people that are sharing these stories. And as I've mentioned before, storytelling is ever changing. We are constantly evolving and changing. Different storytellers will say the same story in a different way. They'll focus on different elements. So at the end of the day, folklore is always changing. So what about the unicorn of tomorrow? Where do you see the unicorn story going in the future? Because in many ways the story has stayed very similar, but there's lots of things that have changed. We've gone from the archetypal, you know, creature with the head of a stag, the body of a horse, the feet of a goat, one spiraled horn, to this beautiful, lovely purple-haired, rainbow-maned character here. And all of them are valid depictions of the unicorn, I think. So thank you. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on about unicorns. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. And does anyone have any questions at all? I'll hope to answer them if I can.
I will say this was wonderful. I did not know how much they've evolved over time. I mean, that was fascinating to learn all of that. Does anyone have any questions on here?
I don't really have, I don't know if it's a question per se, but I guess pertaining to your last little slide there about where you see them going in the future, it makes me think of a couple movies I've seen them recently in.
Okay.
I saw about a decade ago in Cabin in the Woods. There was, I don't know if you've seen the movie.
Yes.
But like there's a bunch of, it's a very meta movie about horror movies where there's a bunch of monsters that could show up and you see a unicorn in it as one of the vicious monsters. And we don't need to go into details of what happens, but you do see them as kind of vicious monsters. And then very recently, I saw that second Shazam movie that just was out. And in it, a whole bunch of monsters start swarming into a city. And it comes out through the course of the movie that there's a monster that's feared by the other monsters. It's the most ferocious monster, and it turns out to be unicorns. And they're these big, hulking, monstrous, giant beasts who the characters have to persuade to help them. And it was really interesting to see them portrayed in a different way like that. I don't know if it's indicative of how they're going to be portrayed in the future if it's swinging that way, but it made me think of that. And I don't know if you saw it or what you thought of it.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because that's actually very typical of like classical depictions of the unicorn as this really ferocious creature. In fact, the unicorn was seen as the most, or one of the most ferocious creatures, but now it's completely changed in pop culture. You know, it's this lovely, sparkly, friendly, wholesome creature. So it's quite interesting that there's now a swing to it going back as being a ferocious creature. I'm not sure if that's just playing on most people's ideas of it being very friendly and wholesome, but yeah, it's just interesting that it's going back to kind of previous depictions of it.
Yeah, I have a 6-year-old, and she loves unicorns, and there's a couple different books that she likes. There's a book series called Unicorn Academy, where it's a bunch of kids who go to school to learn how to take care of their unicorn friends who they're good friends with, and unicorns are all very kind. But then she has another book called She Wanted to Be Haunted, and it's about a cute little cottage whose parents are Dracula's castle and a witch's hut, and she wants to be spooky like them, but she's so cute, she just keeps attracting all these cute animals and all rainbows and things. But then finally she attracts a unicorn, and she's so upset that she attracted a unicorn, but then the unicorn is ferocious and it chases off all the other animals and it tears up the pretty green grass in her yard, and she's so happy to have a ferocious unicorn there. And it's just really fun to see the spin that goes back to what it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why all of these wealthy, noble families wanted to be associated with the unicorn. You know, they wanted to, this was a status symbol, but it was also a bit of like an intimidation thing as well. They were really aligning themselves up with this ferocious beast that, although was a symbol of honor and purity, was also a symbol of strength and elusiveness and rarity. So yeah, definitely pretty different to the unicorn trends that we mostly see today.
And it's like everybody has a horse, but my horse has a sword.
Exactly. And magical abilities.
Well, that was wonderful, Erin. Thank you for all of that. I learned so much about these kids' books now.
I had no idea about the dark, serious history. I was a kid of the 80s, so I was very much, I mean, I was scarred for life by The Last Unicorn because I was shown at a very young age, and that movie is terrifying. But
I know.
I didn't know. I didn't know about the dark underbelly of the unicorn world.
Actually, The Last Unicorn
cool.
is a really strangely historically, for an animated children's film, it's very kind of historically accurate for the for the unicorn. So yeah, very kind of sad and whimsical, but yeah, it's got some of the right notes.
Well, if that's it, then we'll wrap up today. You will
Thank
have,
you.
we will have this on YouTube tomorrow, so you can be able to catch it there, and then we can via email chat about everything else. But thank you so much for taking the time today to present with us. This was very wonderful. This was, I mean, like I said, I did not know any of this, so I'm excited. I missed the first part. I'm going to go back and watch tomorrow morning so I can catch the whole thing. But thank you again.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And if anyone has any other questions, they're watching a recording later on, you can email me at celticmythspodcast@outlook.com, or catch me on celticshan.co.uk. You can find me on there and ask me any unicorn questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.